Our first family reunion in years. I never wanted to tell you this, my aunt said. What she revealed shattered my perception of. I didn't want to go to the family reunion. It had been years since I'd last seen most of them, and to be honest, I wasn't exactly itching to reconnect. Family gatherings in my family always ended up being this messy mix of forced smiles, old grudges, and stories no one wanted to hear. But when Aunt Claudette called me and insisted I come this year, I felt something was different. She didn't ask like she normally did. There was a weight in her voice, a kind of urgency that I hadn't heard before. Ronald, she said, her voice shaky. You need to come this time. There's something you need to know. Something. I can't carry by myself anymore. I remember gripping my phone, caught off guard. Aunt Claudette was known for being dramatic, sure. She'd always been the family's eccentric. But this was different. There was no playfulness in her voice, no hint of her usual quirkiness. I pressed her for details, but all she would say was, "You'll understand when you're here. Just come." I should have ignored it. But curiosity got the better of me, and the next thing I knew, I was packing a bag and heading to Maple Creek, Vermont, the town where my family had lived for generations. When I arrived in Maple Creek, it was like stepping back in time. The place hadn't changed a bit. The old diner on Main Street was still standing, its faded red neon sign buzzing faintly in the evening light. The gas station still had the same rickety pumps that looked like they were one bad storm away from collapsing. Even the air smelled the same, pine trees, damp earth, and a faint trace of smoke from someone's wood stove. I pulled up to Aunt Claudette's house and parked in the gravel driveway. The house was old, with peeling paint and sagging porch steps. My cousin Leota was sitting on those steps, smoking a cigarette like she had been waiting for me. She looked up when I got out of the car, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Well, look who decided to show up," she said, exhaling a puff of smoke. Her black hair, now streaked with silver, fell in messy waves around her face. "Guess the prodigal son returns." Leota and I used to be close when we were kids, but time and distance had turned us into strangers. Still, there was something comforting about seeing her there, like no matter how much things changed, she would always be the same sharp-tongued, no-nonsense Leota. Inside, the house was already buzzing with activity. Relatives I hadn't seen in years were milling around, talking over each other and passing around plates of food. My uncle Zeb was sitting in the corner, chewing tobacco and arguing with someone about politics. My younger brother Alden showed up late, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, which honestly was his default expression. Dinner was chaotic, as always. Kids were running around screaming, adults were trying to keep their plates from being knocked over, and Aunt Claudette was fluttering around the room, trying to make sure everyone was fed. I was halfway through my second helping of green bean casserole when Claudette stood up and tapped her fork against her glass. The room went quiet. Not because anyone respected her authority, but because we all knew Claudette loved to make announcements. Most of the time, they were harmless, like when she announced she was starting a new diet or when she wanted to share her latest vision. But this time, her face was pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the glass. "I never wanted to tell you this," she began, her voice cracking. "But I can't keep it to myself anymore. It's time." She gestured toward the old family portrait hanging on the wall behind her. It was a black and white photo of my grandparents and their 4 children, including my dad. I'd seen it 1,000 times before, but now it felt different, heavier somehow. "That man," Claudette said, pointing to my grandfather in the photo, "was not who you think he was." The room exploded into murmurs. People were whispering, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. My uncle Zeb chuckled nervously. "What are you talking about, Claudette?" he asked. "Harold was a farmer. A damn good one, too." Claudette shook her head. "No, he wasn't. Not entirely." What followed was the kind of story that would have sounded ridiculous if it weren't coming from her mouth. According to Claudette, my grandfather, Harold Beauregard, had a secret past, a past that none of us had ever known about. During World War II, she claimed, Harold had been involved in something called Operation Chrysanthemum. It wasn't clear exactly what this operation was, but from the way Claudette described it, it wasn't above board. She said he had worked as a courier, smuggling documents, money, and sometimes even people across enemy lines. "Was he working for the government?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. "Yes," she said. "And no. It was complicated. He did some of it for the Allies, sure. But some of it was for other groups." "Other groups?" Alden asked, narrowing his eyes. "What the hell does that mean?" Claudette hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. "It means he did what he had to do to survive. To protect this family." The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. It sounded crazy, like something out of a spy movie. But the way she spoke, the way her voice cracked with emotion, made it hard to dismiss. She went on to explain how Harold's actions during the war had left a trail of consequences that followed him long after he came back home. There were threats, mysterious letters, and even a few times when strangers showed up at the farm asking questions. He never talked about it, Claudette said. Not to your grandmother, not to his kids. But I saw things. I heard things. I thought back to the stories my dad used to tell me about Harold. He'd always painted him as this stoic, hard-working man who cared about nothing more than his family and his land. But there were gaps in those stories, little inconsistencies that I'd never thought twice about. Like the time Grandpa Harold disappeared for 3 days in 1978. My dad had said he'd gone hunting, but now I wasn't so sure. What happened to him during those 3 days? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Claudette's face darkened. He wasn't hunting, she said. He was negotiating. The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone was looking at each other, searching for some kind of explanation, some way to make sense of what Claudette was saying. But she wasn't done. I didn't want to believe it either, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. But there are things you don't know. Things he did. Things he had to do. And those things, they didn't go away. What are you saying? Leota asked, her voice sharp. That we're still in danger? Claudette didn't answer right away. She just looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. Finally, she said, I think they're still watching. And if something happens, you need to be ready. I didn't sleep that night. After Claudette's revelation, my head was spinning. My grandfather, Harold Beauregard, wasn't the man I thought he was. He had a secret life, dangerous, messy, and now, apparently, still haunting us. It sounded impossible, but Claudette's voice, her trembling hands, and the fear in her eyes made it clear. She believed every word she said. The next morning, I woke up to find Claudette sitting on the porch, staring out at the misty hills with a cup of coffee in her hand. I joined her, and for a while, we just sat in silence. Finally, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me all night. Who's watching, Claudette? Who are you so afraid of? She didn't look at me. She just sipped her coffee and said, the people Harold crossed. They never forget. They don't forgive. For the next few days, I stayed in Maple Creek. I told myself it was to help Claudette clean up after the reunion, but the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It started small, a black SUV parked down the street, the same one I saw twice in 2 days. A man in a dark coat lingering outside the diner, watching me through the window. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then, on the 3rd night, things escalated. It was late, and I was sitting in Claudette's living room, flipping through an old photo album, when I heard a noise outside. A crunch of gravel. I froze, my ears straining. Then came the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. Claudette? I whispered, but she was already standing in the doorway, a shotgun in her hands. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. They're here, she said. Before I could respond, there was a loud knock at the door. Claudette didn't move. Neither did I. The knock came again, harder this time. Then a voice, low and gravelly, called out. Mrs. Beauregard. We just want to talk. Claudette's grip on the shotgun tightened. Go away, she called back. There's nothing for you here. The man outside laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Oh, there's plenty here. You know that as well as I do. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever this was, they weren't here for a friendly chat. And they weren't going to leave empty-handed. The next few moments were a blur. Claudette shouted for me to grab the revolver from the drawer in the kitchen. Before I could move, the front door burst open, and 2 men stormed inside, both dressed in black. Claudette fired the shotgun, the sound deafening in the small space. One of the men dropped to the ground, clutching his leg and screaming in pain. The other man lunged at her, but I managed to grab the revolver and fire a shot, hitting him in the shoulder. He stumbled back, cursing loudly, and Claudette slammed the butt of the shotgun into his head, knocking him out cold. My hands were shaking as I stood there, the revolver still clutched in my hand. The man on the floor was moaning, blood pooling around his leg. Claudette was breathing hard, her face set in a grim mask. They'll send more, she said, her voice steady despite everything. We need to end this. Tonight. After tying up the 2 men and dumping them in the basement, Claudette told me everything. The people who had come after us were part of the same network my grandfather had worked for during the war. They weren't just criminals, they were powerful, connected, and ruthless. Harold had stolen something from them decades ago, something valuable enough that they were still hunting for it. What did he take? I asked. Claudette hesitated, then walked over to the fireplace. She reached into the chimney and pulled out a small, rusted metal box. Inside was a stack of old documents, some kind of codebook, and a bundle of cash so old it looked like it might disintegrate if you touched it. This, she said. This is what they want. I stared at the box, my mind racing. So, we give it to them? Claudette shook her head. If we give it to them, they'll kill us. We have to destroy them first. The next 24 hours were the most intense of my life. Using the documents in the box, Claudette pieced together a trail of information that led to the network's operations. Names, locations, bank accounts, it was all there. My grandfather had been meticulous, keeping a record of everything as insurance in case they ever came after him. Together, we devised a plan. Claudette had a contact, a retired FBI agent named Jack, who owed her a favor. She called him, and after some convincing, he agreed to help. Using the information in the box, we exposed the network, leaking their financial dealings and operations to the authorities. Jack pulled a few strings, and within hours, their accounts were frozen, their safe houses raided, and their key players arrested. But we weren't done yet. Claudette wanted to send a message, one they wouldn't forget. That night, we drove to the network's local hideout, a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of town. With Jack's help, we rigged the place with explosives. Claudette stood outside, holding the detonator, her face lit by the moonlight. "This is for Harold," she said, her voice cold and steady. Then she pressed the button. The explosion lit up the night sky, a roaring inferno that consumed everything inside. It was dangerous, reckless, and probably illegal. But as I stood there, watching the flames, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: closure. The next morning, the news was filled with stories about the raid. The network was in shambles, its leaders arrested or on the run. Claudette and I watched the coverage in silence, the weight of everything we'd done settling over us. "What happens now?" I asked. Claudette sighed. "Now, we move on. And hope they don't come back." It wasn't the happy ending I'd hoped for, but it was enough. For the first time in years, I felt like I understood my family, its secrets, its sacrifices, and the strength it took to survive. As I packed my bags to leave Maple Creek, I looked at the old family portrait one last time. Harold Beauregard was still a mystery, but now I knew the truth: he wasn't just a farmer. He was a fighter. And in the end, so were we.